Hello and welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland Show. My name is Renata von Tscharner. I'm the president of the Charles River Conservancy, and we are today very lucky to have somebody who knows the most about the Charles River. I've worked on the Charles River for the last 15 years or so, but today we have Karl Haglund. Welcome.
Thank you.
Karl Haglund has written a book about the Charles River that probably many of you know about, Inventing the Charles River. It was co-published by the MIT Press and the Charles River Conservancy, a great book that you definitely want to have always around for reference. And so Karl has been looking at the river when you did this book as a PhD thesis at MIT.
Right.
And you've been working as a planner with the MDC and now the DCR to make these inventions possible. And this show today is really to give an overview of how long sometimes it takes to make these inventions and to realize those parks. And you're going to take us through history here and give us a kind of overview of some of how these parks were created.
So I think many people are now familiar with the fact that the Charles River was once much larger than it is today, that the back bay was a real body of water that got filled in, and over time we decided to build a dam underneath what's now Beacon Street, and we filled what was once the Charles River and turned it into a neighborhood called the Back Bay. And it was not long after the Back Bay was begun that a Bostonian named George Snelling suggested that we should look at the example of Hamburg and turn the river into a park, into what he called a water park. But it took a long time to make that happen. It was more than 30 years later that the city of Boston built Charles Bank, a long stretch between Leverett Circle and Charles Circle. It included gymnasiums for women and girls and for men and boys, and a promenade along the edge of the river. Then Boston decided that they didn't like the river going up and down with every high tide, and a dam was built at the area between Leverett Circle and today's Land Boulevard. On the surface of the dam was a park intended to connect the Charles Bank of Olmsted with a new park that the city of Cambridge was going to build near the Lechmere Canal. As part of constructing the dam, a strip of land was created along the edge of Beacon Hill, about 300 feet wide, and then as it turned the corner along the Back Bay, it narrowed down to only about 100 feet wide, and people took their hats and best Sunday clothes and went for promenades along this very narrow strip of land, and we had the beginning of what became the Esplanade. In 1936, that park was significantly widened and lagoons were created, a couple of islands were built, and soon after that, the temporary bandshell that had served the Boston Pops became a permanent feature on the Esplanade thanks to the generosity of the Hatch family, and we now know it as the Hatch Shell. The Stowe Memorial Embankment of 1936 lasted only about 15 years before we decided to put Storrow Drive through. But if you think that we had the idea in 1860, and it took us more than 70 years to decide how we were going to create the Esplanade.
So you used kind of the Esplanade as an example of how long it took to invent the first part.
Sometimes it seems like it takes forever to do these things,
Yeah.
and you think that we ought to be faster than that. But it turns out that 50 years later, we're still taking a long time to build parks.
So we're going to go downriver now and kind of look at an area that is still in the process of invention.
After the hurricanes of 1954 and 55, the government decided that the dam by itself with its single large lock was not enough, and they decided they would go downstream. You can see here in this photograph that below the dam and the park on the dam where the Science Museum had moved, the whole area between the first dam and Boston Harbor is filled with parking lots and railroad side yards and freight sheds for potatoes and all kinds of other things. It was a real industrial zone downstream. But the legislature decided that they should go and build a new dam and include pumps that would be able to push against the tide and protect Boston and Cambridge in a way that the old existing lock next to the Science Museum could not do. So they built the new dam. They actually built it, instead of white limestone, they built it in red brick. And even before the dam was officially dedicated, the blizzard of '78 came along and the pumps were turned on, and they pumped against the high tide for over a week to keep the Back Bay and East Cambridge from flooding.
So we have now this new dam, and in a way this new dam now defines an area which is called the new basin.
So you have this industrial zone of about a half mile. The dam gets built, and the Parks Agency is asked to begin acquiring land. And so they buy a piece of land from the federal government that had been used as a garage and a parking lot for federal vehicles. And that was one of the first parcels acquired with the idea of creating a future park just downstream of the Science Museum.
Now, not all viewers might be able to identify. Let's in it, because right now we see the elevated bridge where the green line goes over. What's missing on this picture is the Museum of Science, although I see the beginning there. There's a beginning of the Museum of Science is there as a landmark. And right now there's, of course, EF is standing on that land. So it's an area which has been always separate, but is now coming in to its own.
I think that one of the very important pieces about this story is the individuals and organizations who got interested in this piece of land that nobody else paid much attention to. And one of the first people to do that was a writer and editor named Max Hall. He wrote a book about the Charles. He had tried to persuade Harvard to write an article about it, and he finally wrote the article himself, and then it was published as The Charles, the People's River. And right after he finished that book, he wrote an article in the Boston Globe about what he called the lost half mile on the Charles, this funny area between the Science Museum and Boston Harbor. And he said, this is one of the few places along the river where people don't have access, and we need to change that. Another event that changed this area was when Boston Duck Tours was invented, and they came to the Parks Agency, to the MDC, and said, we would like to put boats in the river. And so they built this temporary ramp into the water, and they started taking people out on tours of the river, and that's become a great introduction for people visiting the city to see what the city looks like from the middle of the Charles.
Oh, here you see a duck tour going into the old location.
You can see the white fan of the ducks, and behind them two very tall apartment buildings and the office building for Education First, a Swedish company, was built on the anticipation that there was going to be a park next to them eventually. This was in the 1980s, and then along came the Big Dig, the Central Artery Project, and you can see in this photograph that the temporary and some of the permanent ramps headed towards the City Square Tunnel and later the Zakim Bridge have started to be constructed, even though it still looks like kind of an industrial zone. Hasn't become a park yet.
But there was planning going on, and here, or was that the first sketch of green along the water? And maybe that was a response to Max Hall's idea that this needs to be green all along.
So in issuing the permits to build a new bridge over the Charles River, state agencies said, we need to get together and we need to create public access along the water's edge on both sides of the river. You see here the old bridge across the Charles and the double-decked elevated highway that goes up 93 to the northeast and Route 1 to the northwest, and pretty much covers this, about half of this whole area. But everybody knew that those old double-decked highways were going to come down and to be replaced by what became the Zakim Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the task of deciding what should go in this neighborhood along the water's edge was the need for a plan. And so the Cambridge firm of Carr, Lynch and Sandell was hired to do a master plan for the river, and they identified the opportunities to create land along the water's edge. They also, if we go a little further into their plans, we see that they have responded to the lagoons and the islands up along behind the Hatch Shell and further upriver, and they have created a water channel that creates two islands, a wedge-shaped island and a round island. The other important thing they realized was that we could get closer to the water by lowering those seawalls, which had been built when it was still tidal and we still had floods. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at the close-ups of what they planned, we see how first Paul Revere Park was built next to the new dam and pumping station, and then Nashua Street Park, and finally the last and largest park, North Point Park, with its two islands. Here's a view of what everyone imagined that people along the water's edge and people out on boats on the river would see as they pass through this new area of parks. Another important part of the master plan was recognizing the opportunity for pedestrians to move through this area. And so you see these red lines on the map that represent proposed new bridges that would connect Cambridge with Charlestown for the first time. We had railroads in this area starting in the 1830s, and here we are in 2010. We are finally building a pedestrian bridge over all those railroads that connects North Point Park with Paul Revere Park in Charlestown.
So you have been involved with planning of this North Point Park, the new basin, for
longer than I care to think about.
Yeah.
And each time we started a new project, we thought, well, this is only going to take a year or two, and then there'd be permitting, and then people would want it to be part of the design process. And it just takes a long time when you're dealing with a very complicated area that includes brownfields and industrial relics. But the first park that was opened was next to the dam and was very much greeted by the neighborhood as one of the important first steps of creating this new set of parks between the Science Museum and the harbor.
That's the Paul Revere Park. Yeah. And
the second park to be finished was Nashua Street, and Nashua Street provides one of the great views of the Zakim Bridge, to go down and sit on these granite steps and look across toward North Point Park and look downstream toward the towers of the Zakim Bridge.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of bridges, we see the Zakim Bridge here, and the little islands, but there is going to be a bridge that connects the North Point Park with the Revere Park.
So the Parks Agency invited some engineers and an architect, and this group of designers went up to the top of Spalding Hospital, and you see in the next image, this was the view they had as they sat on the roof of the Spalding Hospital and tried to figure out how they could get a pedestrian bridge over the duck boat ramps, which is on the left edge of the photograph. You see that little piece of water going into the park, and then cross 4 railroad tracks and land underneath the Zakim Bridge. And they came up with the sketch. The architect said that a bridge was like a gymnast. A gymnast can create support by pushing down on the rings or hanging from the rings. And the idea was to remind us that bridges can be supported from above or from below. Here, in this case, if you support the bridge from above when it's over the railroad tracks, you keep its height as low as possible. But he said when you get into the park, you'd like that structural support to go away. And so he sketched out this S-curve of a tubular steel truss, and then they took some computer tests to see if this concept could actually be made to work. And here you see the bridge as they sketched it out on both sides of the river. By making it a curve, an S-curve, they were able to reuse some of the footings that had been built for the temporary artery loop ramps. So you have this S-curve looking down at the bridge, and as you walk up it, you see how the structural support falls away from you as you walk down into Paul Revere Park or into North Point Park if you're going the other direction.
And you have some pictures of the bridge being built, put together.
This was a very challenging bridge to build because the angles of the tubular steel pipes had to be very carefully welded together. A great little foundry in Maine was responsible for building this bridge. They put it together to make sure that all the pieces fit, and then they actually cut it down the middle and into 14 pieces and loaded it onto trucks and brought it down to the edge of the river where it had to be re-welded. I think if we go to the next picture, we'll see the welders crawling all over these separate pieces, welding them together, and on the left side of the picture is a barge. What's going to happen is the first section that we're looking at of the bridge is going to be loaded onto that barge, and then in the middle of the night at 10 minutes after 12, when the last commuter trains pull out of North Station, they turned on the floodlights and they picked up this section of bridge and swung it around 180 degrees and lowered it onto the concrete structural supports that you see on the left side of this picture.
This must have been quite an exciting moment for you to see that
well,
growing up.
They actually did. It took them 3 different nights to do the sections over the railroad track so they wouldn't get in the way of the operation of the commuter trains. And it really was exciting to be out there and see these floodlights come on, and then the cranes picking up these big pieces of steel pipe and putting them into place. And then this past July, the week after the 4th of July, the governor came and cut the ribbon, and for the first time in over 100 years, people were able to walk along the river's edge from the Science Museum in Cambridge to the Navy Yard in Charlestown. Mm-hmm. So it was an exciting moment. Well,
so you've given us a very quick tour, and I know I rushed you through that because I love listening to you, and you speak very beautifully about that. Normally, you are given a bit more time, which is really what this knowledge and this project deserves, and so that this is now out to be seen. So people, you, the viewer, Cambridge resident, you should go and see this North Point Bridge, North Bank Bridge and the North Point Park. Give us a glimpse of what else is coming in this area.
Well, as we showed in that slide, the designers developed a concept that would also work on the south side of the river, and so you'll see in this next slide that we have just started this month doing the engineering work on a bridge that would go from underneath the south side of the Zakim Bridge and land near Spalding Hospital and Nashua Street Park in Boston. And then we've also started work on building an attachment. The MBTA has finally decided that they need to replace the drawbridges that the commuter trains cross every day. And the MBTA has agreed to build a walkway that would hang from the side of the new bridge. And then everyone who comes from North Station would be able to walk to the new apartments and the new office buildings in North Point Park, and then they could go upstream along the Cambridge side or downstream to the Navy Yard, and without having to walk all the way around the river, they'll be able to cross directly. It will be the first pedestrian connection on the river since the Weeks footbridge that was completed in the 1920s.
26. The first river crossing for pedestrians.
Yeah.
Below the Watertown Dam, I
Right,
guess. Yeah,
right,
yeah,
right.
yeah. Now, I'm going to skip us back here a few images because I would like you to speak about some other aspects of this plan, because there are other components to it. There are all the green areas that are part of the plan, the mitigation efforts of the Big Dig. Maybe you want to just address some of the other parts of this plan.
If you were to walk out the front door of the Science Museum and walk up to the crosswalk at the light next to the Science Museum garage, you could then walk into North Point Park. And I really encourage people to walk out to that round island. One of the things that the designers realized was that this was an opportunity to get closer to the water. So the seawalls around North Point Park and Nashua Street were actually lowered, but when they got to that round island, they took some of that dirt that they had scraped down to get us closer to the water's edge, and they made a little hill on that round island so that you have a kind of lookout, looking down the river and looking upriver. I think the other thing that was a very important decision of the designers was to reintroduce the richness of planting that had been part of the Esplanade in the 1930s. So if you go to North Point Park or to Paul Revere Park in the next few weeks, you will see literally hundreds of thousands of daffodils that will come out, and they will be followed by flowering perennials and grasses. It's a very rich and inviting plant palette. It's not just trees and grass, and so it's a great place to just hang out. And I think a lot of credit goes to the designers for taking a chance that we could build a park that would be rich and beautiful and also could be maintained on a reasonable budget.
Well, Karl, thank you for giving us an update and also to show us the historic perspective of how long it takes to invent the Charles River parklands. We are very grateful for both your work, your book, as well as your work as a planner, and to bring the long perspective and to hang in there and to make those inventions happen. So you also brought an image about the people who you, sorry, I want to get the credits here, the end of the people you wanted to thank who have been contributing to your visuals.
The Cambridge Historical Commission knows more about the Charles River, I think, than any other organization that's out there, and they are very generous in opening their archives. The Harvard Map Collection has a wonderful set of images, and some of them they regularly exhibit. The MIT Museum has also done its share of explaining the river.
Great. Well, this is, Karl, this has been a wonderful show. Thank you very much. And it will be on YouTube. If you missed it, you can find it under YouTube, Charles River Conservancy. And there it is. But of course, even better than watching this show is to read Karl's book, Inventing the Charles River. And there has so much history, about 450 images in it, a lot of maps. And so it's a treasure that we are very lucky to have. And thank you for writing the book. Thank you for doing the work. And thank you for coming on to the show today.
Thank you very much.